This session will be our last of 4 presentations on translating figures of speech. In this presentation, we'll be talking about different kinds of figures of speech, in addition to what we've already seen. First of all, though, let's do a bit of review. What is a figure of speech? Why is it important to recognize figures of speech in the source language? And what are the 3 main ways to translate a figure of speech? If you're in a workshop setting, go ahead and pause here and see if you can answer those questions. A figure of speech is a word or phrase that has a different meaning from its literal definition. Why is it important to recognize figures of speech? Well, in order to keep the same meaning, as well as the same effect in the target language. And what are the 3 main ways to translate figures of speech? Well, first would be to keep the same figure of speech, but only if it has the same meaning in the receptor language. The second would be to leave out the figure of speech and just translate the meaning directly. And the third would be to substitute a different figure of speech that has the same meaning. In today's presentation, we're going to see a number of different kinds of figures of speech that are used in the Bible. The priority is not to remember the technical names of all these different kinds of figures of speech, but what is important is that you can recognize that a figure of speech is being used and you can discern its function. So what figures of speech can you see in the following verses? Acts 14:28, and they remained no little time with the disciples. Acts 19:23, about that time there arose no little disturbance concerning the way. Acts 21:39, Paul says, I am a citizen of no obscure city. So try to describe this kind of figure of speech in your own words. And also see if you can re-express each of these examples to give the author's intended meaning in a different way. So go ahead and pause here and see if you can do that. What we saw on the previous slide are examples of a figure of speech called litotes. In a litote, the speaker says the negative of the opposite of what he wants to say, and it's usually used for emphasis. Here's another example in Acts 20:12. They took the youth away alive and were not a little comforted. So that is the negative, not a little comforted, of the opposite of what he wants to say. The meaning is that they were greatly comforted. They took the youth away alive, greatly comforted. Another example, Mark 9:41. Whoever gives you a cup of water to drink because you belong to Christ will certainly not lose his reward. The meaning here is that he will certainly receive a reward. So a litote is used for added emphasis. I'd like you to do a couple exercises now with this figure of speech litotes. Find the examples of litotes in the following passages. Re-express the meaning positively, keeping the original emphasis. So first, Mark 12:34. You are not far from the kingdom of God. 2 Corinthians 1:8. We don't want you to be uninformed, brothers. So go ahead and pause and take a few minutes to do that exercise. If you are done, in TN, Translator's Notes for Mark 12:34, it gives the option, you are close to entering the kingdom of God. For 2 Corinthians 1:8, GNT says, we want to remind you. CEV says, we want you to know. Let's look now at another kind of figure of speech. Here are some examples. There are millions of mangoes on that tree. Well, really? Millions? The meaning probably is there are lots of mangoes on that tree. That was the best movie ever. The best movie ever made? Meaning is probably that movie is very good. Everybody is going to the soccer match. Everybody in the whole world? The meaning is probably many people are going to that soccer match. My mother will kill me if I get home late. Really? You'll be dead? The meaning is probably that you'll be punished severely for coming home late. This sack I'm carrying weighs a ton. Thousands of kilos? The meaning is probably the sack is very heavy. Don't talk so loudly. The whole world will hear you. Well, that probably means lots of people will hear you. So this is a figure of speech that we have just seen in these examples. How would you describe in your own words this figure of speech? Go ahead and pause and take a minute to discuss that. We call this type of figure of speech hyperbole, and here is a definition. Hyperbole is a deliberate exaggeration for dramatic effect or emphasis, not meant to be taken literally. So for dramatic effect, you could say, we're starving. Not that you're actually going to die, but you're very hungry. He's crazy. Or for emphasis, the whole world was there, indicating many people were. He doesn't know anything. Now, if there's a hyperbole in your source text, and if translating that literally would give a wrong meaning in the receptor language, then try translating the correct meaning directly. And always do your best to keep the emphasis of the original. I'd now like you to do a few exercises having to do with this figure of speech, hyperbole. So re-express the following hyperboles in non-figurative language. So giving the meaning directly without a figure of speech. But also try to keep the original emphasis. In Mark 1:5, NIV says, the whole Judean countryside and all the people of Jerusalem went out to him. So how might you say that without hyperbole? Go ahead and pause and try and do that. Well, CEV says, from all Judea and Jerusalem, crowds of people went out to John. Although I see from all Judea and Jerusalem is still hyperbole. You could say, many people from the province of Judea and the city of Jerusalem went out to hear John. Okay, another example, Acts 17:6. These men have turned the whole world upside down, have come here also. So how would you express that without hyperbole? Well, GNT says, these men have caused trouble everywhere. Now they have come to our city. Well, everywhere is not the whole world, but it still is hyperbole everywhere, right? So the NET translation says, these men have caused trouble throughout the world. That then is not in the whole world, but in areas of the world. So that would be a way to do it. Here is another example from 1 Timothy 6:4, where Paul is writing Timothy about false teachers. And in NIV, he says they are conceited and understand nothing. Now, if for you a literal translation would give a wrong meaning, because obviously these men understood some things, you would need to translate the meaning directly, dropping the hyperbole. So pause and take a moment. How might you do that? Well, NLT says they lack understanding. So that is translating the meaning directly without the figure of speech. Let's look now at another kind of figure of speech. Consider the following examples. What is the speaker really trying to say? Nice weather we're having after a week of rain. That was a clever thing to do after someone makes a bad mistake. Or, you don't want much, do you? A father speaking to his son who's just asked for a brand new bicycle. What we saw on the previous slide were examples of the figure of speech irony and sarcasm. Irony is saying the opposite of what is meant. Here in the illustration it says, "Good job, squish." Obviously he did not think it was a good job. From the previous slide, "Nice weather we're having after a week of rain." It's the opposite. We're having terrible weather. Sarcasm is irony that's used to criticize someone or to rebuke them. That was a clever thing to do after someone makes a bad mistake. So the meaning is the exact opposite. That was a dumb thing to do, and the sarcasm is used to criticize and rebuke them. The purpose of sarcasm is usually to rebuke. Here's an example from Mark 7:9. Jesus told the Pharisees, "You have a fine way of setting aside the commands of God in order to observe your own traditions." Now, Jesus is not saying this in earnest, but in a sarcastic, negative way. Here is a version that gives the meaning, dropping the sarcasm. NLT says, "You skillfully sidestep God's law in order to hold on to your own tradition." Here's another example of irony and sarcasm. In 2 Samuel 6:20, NIV says, "How the king of Israel has distinguished himself today, going around half naked, in full view of the slave girls of his servants, as any vulgar fellow would." Now this was said by Michal, the wife of David, after seeing David dancing before the Lord. But she did not mean literally that he had distinguished himself. She was meaning the opposite, that he had dishonored himself, and she used irony and sarcasm to show that. So now think of other examples of irony or sarcasm, either from your own language or from Scripture. Take a few minutes to pause the presentation and discuss those. Here are some principles for translating irony and sarcasm. First, you need to discover the speaker's intended meaning. Then re-express the meaning, taking care not to lose the negative attitude of the speaker or the emotional impact of what he said. Now, in some languages, rhetorical questions may be used to express irony. So, for example, from one of our previous slides, a rhetorical question could be, "Don't you have a fine way of setting aside the commands of God?" We're now going to do a few exercises with this figure of speech, irony and sarcasm. So, how is irony or sarcasm communicated in the following passages? You may need to check the context of each passage. And how can this be translated idiomatically and keep the same attitude? So the first example, Mark 12:10. Jesus is speaking to the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the elders. And he asks them, "Have you not read this scripture?" Well, he knows they've read the scriptures before, but he's being sarcastic to make a point. They should know and be doing these things. So how could you translate the meaning so that it comes across with this attitude of sarcasm? Take a minute to think about that. So one thing he could say would be, you have studied the scriptures, don't you know? Or surely you have read the scriptures. Another example, Mark 15, verse 18. They began to salute Jesus. Hail, King of the Jews! Now the soldiers are mocking Jesus before he was crucified. Do you really think that they think he's the King of the Jews? And is this the way people treat a king, to beat him and to spit upon him? No, they're being sarcastic and saying, Hail, King of the Jews. So how could you translate that and with the idea that the sarcasm is present? Well, one option would be, as NLT does, then they saluted him and taunted, Hail, King of the Jews. So Hail, King of the Jews is the same, but they have added that word that they are taunting him, and that shows they are being sarcastic. Here, the T for T translation says, then in order to ridicule him, they greeted him like they would greet a king, saying, Hooray for the king who rules the Jews. Here's another example. Jesus had been nailed to the cross, and in Mark 15:32, the Jewish religious leaders said, Let the Christ, the King of Israel, come down now from the cross, that we may see and believe. Did these religious leaders believe that he was the Christ, the King of Israel? No. They were addressing him that way with irony. CEV translates this without that figure. If he is the Messiah, the King of Israel, let him come down from the cross. Let's now move on to another kind of figure of speech. This one is called metonymy. Metonymy is where one word represents an associated idea. So for example, you could say the kettle is boiling, but actually a kettle can't boil. It's made of metal. It's the water in the kettle that boils. So in saying that, the kettle is representing the associated idea, the water in the kettle. Another example, I drank a whole bottle of Coke. Now you can't drink a bottle, you can drink a liquid. So here the bottle is representing the Coke in the bottle. Or, my tongue rejoiced. Now the one word tongue here is representing me, I rejoiced. And here is another kind of figure of speech which is very similar to metonymy. It's called synecdoche. In a synecdoche, a part is used to represent the whole. So if you said daily bread, the meaning could be daily food. Bread is a part that is meant to represent a larger whole, like food. He said it to my face. Not just to my face, but he said it directly to me. Under my roof means in my house. Or his word represents what he said, not just one word, but it's used to represent the whole, what he said. So here are some principles in translating metonymy and synecdoche. First, consider translating the meaning directly. Instead of the kettle is boiling, you could say the water is boiling, or the water in the kettle is boiling. He ate the whole dish. If that is communicating a wrong meaning in your language, you could say he ate the whole plateful of food. Another example, he swore allegiance to the crown. Now that's not just to what someone wears on their head. You could say, if there were a problem understanding that, he promised or swore allegiance to obey the king, the one who wears the crown. We'll now do a few exercises with the figure of speech metonymy. Remember, a metonymy is where one word represents an associated idea. So what is the meaning of the metonymy in each of the following passages? In Mark 1:2, it says, "As it is written in Isaiah the prophet." Now, Isaiah is a person, so how can something be written in a person? But that one word is also representing an associated idea. CEV translates it, "in the book written by Isaiah the prophet." So that would be the meaning behind that metonymy. What about Mark 7:6? "This people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me." So the lips is a metonymy representing the associated idea of the whole person. G&T says, "This people honors me with their words." CEV says, "They honor me with what they say." So that is replacing the metonymy with the direct meaning. How about this one, John 1:12? "To all who believed in his name." So the name there is a word representing the whole person. G&T says, all who believed in him. CEV, all who put their faith in him. One last one, John 3:16, "For God so loved the world." The world there is representing the associated idea of all the people in the world. CEV says, "God loved the people of this world so much." Let's now do some exercises with the very related idea of synecdoche. Remember, the figure of speech synecdoche is where a part is used to represent the whole. So what is the meaning of that figure of speech in the following passages? Genesis 8:9, "The dove found no place to set her foot." In CEV, it says, "could not find a place to land." So the part is used to represent the whole. Matthew 22:17, they ask, "Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not?" Now the taxes would not just go to Caesar. That part is representing the whole as being the Roman government or Roman emperor. So G&T here translates to the Roman emperor. Once again, comparing versions can help you find the actual meaning of figures of speech, because meaning-based versions often do not follow the literal form of the figure of speech from the source text. What about Philippians 2:11? "And every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord." G&T here says that all will openly proclaim, and CEV says everyone will openly agree. So it's not just the tongue, that is a part used to represent the whole, all people. 2 Peter 2:14 says, "They have eyes full of adultery." CEV says, all they think about is having sex with someone else's husband or wife. G&T translates that eyes full of adultery with, they want to look for nothing but the chance to commit adultery. So it's not just the eyes that are full of adultery, but the people who have those eyes that are looking for that chance, the part representing the whole. Let's now talk about another kind of figure of speech. Let's say I said, sadly, greed, corruption in high places, and political victimization are all back on their thrones. So what is happening here in this statement? Well, abstract ideas are being talked about as if they were people. Greed, corruption on their thrones. Usually it would be a king or a queen on a throne, but here an abstract idea like greed or corruption is being talked about as if they were people. Or in the illustration, the wind whistled throughout the day. So something is taking on the attributes of people. This is a figure of speech called personification. A definition of personification is things or ideas that are not human are talked about as if they were human. So for example, in Psalm 23:6, David says, "Surely goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life." Now, usually it's human or animals that are able to follow something, not goodness and mercy. Those are being given human attributes here. G&T drops the personification figure of speech and says, "I know that your goodness and love will be with me all my life." So not follow me, but just be with me. And then that is translating the meaning directly. Personification is used for dramatic effect. Now, if personification does not sound natural in the receptor language, consider adjusting the form in order to translate the same meaning and have a similar effect in the translation. So, for instance, the sea was angry. The sea is taking on a human quality, being able to feel anger. If that didn't sound natural, you could translate the meaning directly. The sea was very rough. Another example, the ground was thirsty. Usually people are thirsty. If that does not sound natural, you could say the ground was very dry. The trees were dancing, or the meaning, the trees were swaying in the wind. The earth opened its mouth. The earth doesn't usually have a mouth. That is a human attribute. So to translate the meaning, you could say a huge hole appeared in the ground. So here are some exercises I'd like you to do using the figure of speech personification. So try to re-express the following passages without using personification. And remember to compare with other Bible versions, especially meaning-based versions, to see if they might have clarified this figure of speech. So Mark 5:34, "Your faith has made you well." Acts 11:22, "The report of this came to the ears of the church in Jerusalem." Acts 28:4, "Though he has escaped from the sea, justice has not allowed him to live." Now, as you'll see in NIV and G&T, justice has been interpreted to be the name of a goddess. So take a few minutes and pause here and see if you can re-express these personifications without using that figure of speech, just giving the meaning directly. Now for another type of figure of speech called apostrophe, which is actually very closely related with personification. Apostrophe is a type of personification when something not alive is addressed directly as if it were alive. So for example, Psalm 24:7, "Lift up your heads, O gates." The gates are being referred to directly as if they are alive. Jeremiah 47:6, "Ah, sword of the Lord, how long till you are quiet? Put yourself into your scabbard, rest and be still." Or 1 Corinthians 15:55, "Where, O death, is your victory? Where, O death, is your sting?" So in English, an apostrophe figure is often indicated by the use of O or another exclamation. "O gates, O death, and it's also often indicated by the use of the second person, you or your. O gates, lift up your heads. So addressing something directly as if it were alive. So how might you translate the meaning directly without using an apostrophe? Well, for the last one, where, O death, is your victory, you could, instead of referring to death directly, you could say, death will not overcome us. Death will never harm us again. Apostrophe is used for dramatic effect. If addressing non-living things as if they were living is unnatural in the target language, you will need to drop the figure of speech and translate the meaning directly. But try to keep the same effect. I'd like you now to do a few exercises with the figure of speech apostrophe. So in case apostrophe is not natural in the target language, how can the following passages be expressed without using apostrophe? Matthew 2:6, and you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judea, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. So go ahead and pause and think about how you could maybe say that without using the direct address apostrophe. Well, one might be to say, instead of and you, O Bethlehem, say you who live in Bethlehem in Judea province. Your town is certainly very important. That's the T4T version. Or Translator's Notes Displays says, you people of the town of Bethlehem in the land of Judea. So that is not addressing Bethlehem directly, but is dropping the apostrophe and talking of the people who live there. How about another example? Mark 11:14. Jesus said to the tree, may no one ever eat fruit from you again. So once again, pause. How could you say that without using apostrophe? If you compare other versions, meaning-based versions, those can give you some clues at times. Here CEV says, never again will anyone eat fruit from this tree. So not addressing the tree directly, but no one will eat fruit from this tree. One final example, Revelation 12:12. Therefore rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell in them. How might you say the meaning directly without addressing the heavens directly? One way would be like Translator's Notes display. All who live in heaven rejoice, celebrate. Or another way, let there be joy in heaven, let all who live in heaven rejoice. So that is the end of all the various kinds of figures of speech we'll be teaching about in this workshop. Let's quickly review what we have seen. Figures of speech include idioms, metaphor and simile, euphemism, litotes, hyperbole, irony and sarcasm, metonymy, synecdoche, personification, and apostrophe. Remember, it's not important to remember the technical names of all these different kinds of figures of speech. But it is important for you as translators that you recognize that they are different kinds of figures of speech, and to know how to translate them in case the meaning is not coming across clearly in your language, or if it sounds unnatural from following the literal form of the source text. Here's a question. Can a figure of speech be used in the receptor language when there is no figure of speech in the source text? Well, the answer is yes. A figure of speech can be introduced to express the meaning in a lively and interesting way, or to make the style sound natural in the receptor language. In Luke 22:56, G and T does not have a figure of speech. It says, meaning directly, she looked straight at him. But for the Igede people, in their translation, it was more lively, interesting, natural to use a figure of speech. So instead of she looked straight at him, they translated, she bit him with her eye. And for them, that sounds natural and is more acceptable. I'd like for us to now do some exercises with figures of speech and idioms found in the Gospel of Luke. So for each example on the following slide, first consider whether or not there is a figure of speech. And if you can, name it. Although remember, that's not so important to get the exact name, but just to recognize there is one. But if you can name it, all the better. Next, if there is a figure of speech, is it showing emphasis or dramatic effect? And then try to re-express the full meaning in English or your language in an alternate way. So either giving the meaning directly of the figure of speech or substituting it with a different figure of speech that would be natural in the target language. Now, the examples on the following slides are all from a literal version in English, the ESV. Remember to compare with other Bible versions, especially meaning-based versions, as they may make the meaning of that figure of speech more clear or give it directly. Okay, so here are some exercises of figures of speech in Luke, and after each one, just pause this presentation, discuss among yourselves, and then I will try and give possible answers. So for the first one, Luke 1:32, he will be great and will be called the Son of the Most High. So is a figure of speech there? How might you express it without the figure of speech using the same impact? Well, this one does have a figure of speech, a euphemism. Son of the Most High. Most High here is equaling God. Remember, a euphemism is a word or expression used to avoid direct reference to a culturally sensitive topic, and God's name was culturally sensitive for the Jews. Luke 1:37, for nothing will be impossible with God. Pause and discuss. There as well, a figure of speech is used called litotes. In litotes, the speaker says the negative of the opposite of what he wants to say. So the meaning here is everything is possible with God. What about Luke 1:42? Elizabeth is speaking to Mary and says, blessed is the fruit of your womb. Is a figure of speech used there? Pause and discuss. Yes, here it is an idiom, which means an expression whose meaning is different than the meaning of the individual words. Blessed is the baby you are carrying. Luke 1:64. And immediately his mouth was open and his tongue loosed. Pause and discuss how you might say that with the meaning directly or substituting another figure. The figure of speech used there is a metonymy. That is where one word represents an associated idea. What is meant here by his tongue was loosed? Well, at that moment, Zechariah was able to speak again. Luke 2:5, Mary, who was with child. Once again, pause and discuss. This here has to do with Mary being pregnant. So from the previous example, Mary being pregnant is a euphemism. A euphemism is a word or expression used to avoid direct reference to a culturally sensitive topic. Okay, what about this one? Luke 2:19. But Mary treasured up all these things, pondering them in her heart. So go ahead and pause and discuss that one. Well, I don't know exactly the name for this kind of figure of speech, but we don't ponder things in our heart, but in our mind. And so I'm recognizing there is a figure of speech here, and I know some versions would then put that pondering them in her mind rather than heart to make the meaning more clear and direct. How about Luke 5:10? From now on, you will be catching men. Pause and discuss that one. Well, here, an idiom is being used. Remember, an idiom is an expression whose meaning is different than the meaning of the individual words. How about Luke 7:16? Fear seized them all. Discuss if a figure of speech is being used there, and how to maybe say it without the figure of speech. Here, personification is being used. Remember, personification are things or ideas that are not human are talked about as if they were human. Fear here is given a human quality of being able to seize something. How about Luke 11:20? If it is by the finger of God that I cast out demons. So discuss that one. Well, here a synecdoche is being used. Synecdoche is a part is used to represent the whole. So the finger of God here is representing God as a whole, his authority or power. How about Luke 13:33? In any case, I must press on today and tomorrow and the next day, for surely no prophet can die outside Jerusalem. Now this one I'm seeing two figures of speech. So go ahead and pause and see if you can find both and ways to render it without those figures of speech, but giving the meaning directly. Well, a hyperbole is used. Remember, hyperbole is a deliberate exaggeration for dramatic effect or emphasis, not meant to be taken literally. It says no prophet can die outside Jerusalem. Well, did other prophets die outside of Jerusalem? Well, yes, Elijah, Elisha, others. And then also sarcasm is being used here. Remember, sarcasm is a statement used to criticize someone or rebuke them. Jesus here is saying this sarcastically to rebuke the people of Jerusalem for killing the prophets. The next verse, Luke 13:34. O Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets. Is a figure of speech being used there? Discuss that. Well, it is. This is an apostrophe where something is addressed directly. Things or ideas that are not human are talked about as if they were human. So here, Jerusalem, a city, is being talked about as like a human, able to kill prophets. And the final one, Luke 14:26. If anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother, he cannot be my disciple. So discuss that one. Is a figure of speech being used here? Well, yes, this contains hyperbole, a deliberate exaggeration for dramatic effect or emphasis, not meant to be taken literally. Jesus says, who does not hate his own father and mother. But literally hating one's family would have been a violation of the law, which Jesus said they had to fulfill to honor their parents. So he must not mean here that one should literally hate his family. The stress here is on the priority of love. One's loyalty to Jesus must come before loyalty to family. So remember, whenever you translate a figure of speech, always first discover the true meaning that it had in the original source text for the original audience. Consider the author's purpose. Why did he use the figure of speech? And then translate in a way that communicates the meaning, including the emphasis and emotion of the original text. So that is the end of our teaching on figures of speech. Maybe it seems with all those different kinds and different names that it's a bit confusing. But what should be clear is that figures of speech can both make a translation lively and interesting, or they could cause a translation to sound unnatural or have a wrong meaning if they're just following the form of the literal source text. So you need to be very careful in looking for them and in listening for ways in which the translation in your language does not sound natural in order to replace them when necessary with the direct meaning or a substitute in your language that would give the same meaning and be natural. So may the Lord help you in this challenging area in making His Word both meaningful and interesting and lively. God bless, and see you next time. If you're taking this training as part of a translation workshop, you'll see in the green box on the workshop schedule that we've just finished the 4th presentation on how to translate figures of speech, other kinds of figures. In our next class session, the first box in red, we'll be continuing translation of a new passage in Luke chapter 2. I've explained that in another short video because that's what will be taking place as a translation exercise for many of the remaining class periods. But you will also see another box in red for session 1 on day 14 called Team Building, how to work well together in a team. Now we do not have materials prepared for this. It is usually taught by another person, an administrator in a partner organization or in SIL. So I would encourage a partner to teach that class, if at all possible, during this workshop, since team building is really essential for a translation project and working well together in a team. So go ahead now and go on to your next class session, working on the 10 steps through this new passage of Scripture in Luke chapter 2.